Lawyers of Reddit, what's the worst way you've seen a person screw over someone else in court, whether it be criminal, civil, or divorce proceedings? Not the worst, but one that sticks out, that they did to themselves. Woman shows up to court in a "It's party time bitches. Drink up" t-shirt. She was there for her first appearance on a third DUI charge. Judge was not in a humorous mood that day. Nasty custody fight. The ex-wife was a lawyer and represented herself. The ex-husband had a pretty shitty lawyer. She kept calling things back to court trying to get more benefits from him, and his lawyer just let it keep happening, and it was destroying his life. Allegations of child abuse. Was taking so much money that he could barely afford a shit apartment and couldn't afford a car, which both figured in later for custody. Finally, the ex-wife's father, also a lawyer, asked to meet with the judge and mentioned a few things that he knew were going on. One of the children was manic depressive and the ex-wife would take him off his meds before it was the ex-husband's turn for custody. The child abuse allegations were from the ex-husband trying to restrain the child during a manic episode because he wasn't medicated. The ex-wife had intentionally timed the child abuse allegation to fall just before the holidays so the ex-husband couldn't see the kids for Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas. She bragged to family that it would do the maximum emotional damage possible doing it then. The ex-wife had forged documents to overstate the ex-husband's income when alimony was being determined. Oh. And the ex-wife was sleeping with the ex-husband's lawyer. Edit. Forgot to give the outcome. The ex-husband's lawyer was reported to the bar. Not sure what happened there. The judge ordered a review of everything and arranged for a new lawyer for the ex-husband. It was looking like the alimony would be vastly reduced and the ex-husband was going to get custody. But then the ex-husband died. Blood clot. 2 months later. Years of being screwed over. Finally saw a light at the end of the tunnel. But ended up being the wrong light at the end of the wrong tunnel. Prosecutor here. I showed up for a bond hearing one morning and the defendant asked the judge if he could say something. The first words out of his mouth were, "Heyo judge. Look, like, the reason I hit her was because she disrespected me." He did not prevail. Not my case, but still my favorite story. Dude screwed himself over when he went to jury trial for a burglary charge and wore the same distinct sweatshirt he wore the night he committed the crime. Kind of hard to argue the guy in the video isn't your client at that point. Needless to say, he was convicted and spent a few years in document. There's a lawyer in my town who has a reputation for being a real dick. He left a very successful firm to go off on his own. He and the firm negotiated which clients he would take and how eventual fees from those clients would be divided. All seemed fine and dandy. As soon as he's out the door, he sues his old firm saying the deal is unenforceable and that he should 100% of the fees from the clients who came with him. He lost and appealed, lost again and appealed to the state Supreme Court, where they shut his ass down and, in extremely diplomatic language, pretty much called him a dick. Not a lawyer, but when my Phil and Mill got divorced, she wanted to file jointly for the previous year because they were still married. They would have gotten a decent refund. He insisted on filing separately, despite the fact that he would owe $4,000 because he wanted her to also owe the eyes. He did it to frost her ass. More of a case of screwing himself over, but here goes. This was a case another prosecutor in my office had a few years back. 30-year-old defendant was charged with sexual assault of a child after he got his girlfriend's 14-year-old sister pregnant. She actually kept the baby, so the police just waited and got a paternity test. No surprise. Defendant was the father. Defendant wanted probation. Prosecutor refused to offer it. He decided to plead guilty and have a jury trial on punishment. Here in Texas, you can choose to have the jury set punishment. Evidence mostly proceeded as expected. The victim testified to having consensual, aside from not being old enough to consent, sex with the defendant, getting pregnant, etc. Paternity test introduced. Defendant took the stand. His version of events was that he snuck into victim's room at night, covered her mouth, and held her down while he forcibly had sex with her against her will. It seemed like his own lawyer had no idea that's the story he settled on. The jury deliberated about 15 minutes before returning a verdict of 17 years. The maximum possible as charge was 20. When interviewed by the attorneys afterwards, one of them said they decided on 17 years so the defendant would never forget the age of consent in Texas again. Sitting waiting for my client and the judge is giving a mass colloquy for an alternative program on a DUI. Basically probation. Question: has anyone consumed alcohol or taken drugs in the last 24 hours? Obvious answer aside, one dude proudly raises his hand. I smoked some dope last night. He did not get probation. I had a guy admit to being high on meth when he totaled his car and put himself in the hospital during a probation violation hearing for something completely unrelated. The cops picked him up at the hospital when he was discharged. Then he started mouthing off to the cop about fuck the judge, fuck probation, fuck the police. Nobody asked him why he got in the accident. For all I knew, there weren't even DUI charges against him related to the accident. He had just stopped showing up to his probation meetings, so a warrant was put out. But he was kind enough to run his mouth for 5 minutes and admit to a bunch of shit he shouldn't have admitted to. When asked if I wanted to make any closing remarks, I said something like, "No, Your Honor. The record is crystal clear why the state is requesting Mr. Defendant to have his sentence reinstated." And she gave one of those fucking amen kind of looks. One time, I saw an indigent defendant who was in custody tell the judge his public defender wasn't working hard enough and he wanted the judge to appoint different counsel. The judge asked him what specifically was the problem, and he said, "I don't want a female lawyer. I need a man who can take charge and fight for me," or something very similar to that. The judge, also female, said that's not how it works. Then he started yelling and getting into specifics about his public defender. Just mainly, "I don't like her. She won't visit me," etc. The judge is annoyed and looks at him and is like, "Fine. I'll appoint another attorney for you. But because you are not satisfied with your attorney and I need time to appoint you new counsel, I'm not going to hear any other issues today and will reset your case." A few days later, the judge sent defendant notice of his new appointed attorney, who happens to also be female, and notice of the case reset for 6 weeks. The case was originally set for a bond hearing and the DA and his PD had agreed to release him on an unsecured bond, meaning he would have gotten out that day if he hadn't thrown his temper tantrum. Instead, he waited another 6 weeks in jail just to have another female attorney represent. A wife filed for a restraining order because she wanted the house during divorce. Husband has good job, like $200K per year. Employer finds out about restraining order. Husband is fired. He was very specialized employee, so only job he can find close to house. Ex-wife and daughter is $50K. House gets foreclosed. Child support at less than $500 per month. Wife has to get job as waitress. 4 cars get repossessed. Kind of a self-screw, but the MPAA entered DVD John's code for breaking DVD copy protection as part of their lawsuit into their evidence, which then became public record. The code that breaks DVD copy protection was now available to the entire world, defeating the entire purpose of their lawsuit. Was involved in a custody case where a wife cheated on her husband and had a child as a result. She let husband believe the child was his until she was about 5 years old and they were divorcing. To stop him from getting custody, she convinced the biological father to try to get custody, thinking that if he won she would wind up with the child. Became a huge 3-way fight. Multiple sets of grandparents involved. Attorney's fees skyrocketed because the case would have been pretty quick otherwise. She couldn't pay her attorney. Tried to get the BO dad to, got even messier, etc. Basically, there still isn't an agreement all parties will follow. They are in and out of court every year or so. She screwed herself. Not a lawyer, but this story always gets me. My biological grandmother died 20 years ago of ovarian cancer. She left all her money, trusts, bonds to my grandfather to use while alive and disperse after death. My grandfather remarried something like 15 years ago to my step-grandma. My grandfather ended up dying first a few years back. My step-aunt is a greedy bitch who lives on the opposite side of the country. She's lived off of her mother and my grandfather for all of her life. She'd come over and take them on vacation, where she'd use their money to buy herself things and get a free skiing trip about 8x a year. After my grandfather passed, my step-grandma had to move where her children lived to get care for dementia. My step-aunt has access to not only her own mother's estate, but my grandfather's as well, to take care of her needs. That wasn't enough. She decided to try and sue my dad and uncle for their dead biological mother's estate. My dad is bilaterally paralyzed and in a wheelchair. My uncle is a triple bypass survivor with a pacemaker and multiple stents. Both are on fixed disability income. The court date came and I literally wheeled my dad in while my uncle walked with a cane. My step-aunt is entirely able-bodied and rolling in the millions my step-grandma and grandfather worked their whole lives to earn. The judge took one look at the whole picture and she was absolutely denied access to my biological grandmother's estate. We were there for less than an hour. This wasn't my case, but followed it closely because it was an acquaintance's divorce proceedings. He and his now ex-wife shared some commercial property that was worth some dough. They were both on the paperwork/hire access to the same info. Well, some shit hit the fan and the property was in arrears, and I think some lien was filed. The husband would try to talk to his then wife about the whole thing and she would blow him off. Not only would she ignore him and the finances, she started cheating on him. Fast forward to divorce. It's contentious and they get down to fighting for the primary residence whose market value, unencumbered, is much less than the commercial building. She demanded the house and the husband effectively offered to give her the commercial building if he could keep the residence. She never paid attention to how bad off the commercial building was, and for some strange reason her lawyer didn't do any due diligence, so they took the deal. I don't know if the asset allocation included any saving conditions or caveats for the ex-wife, but I'd like to see that her own disinterest may have led to bargaining for an underwater property instead of a paid-off house. I have been in dispute with British Gas for around 10 years. Every now and again they take me to court. Every time I win, and we go away for another few years. The last time I lawyered up, it's in a magistrates, even though it's a civil matter. My solicitor waited for the British Gas guy to swear his oath, to tell the truth, the whole truth, etc. Then asked him what he knew of the previous court cases. When the guy said he didn't know anything about them, my solicitor ripped into him saying he'd just claimed to tell the whole truth, so clearly nothing he says can be trusted. It went on for a few minutes. It was kind of brutal. The magistrates agreed, and we walked away with £600 in costs. It was a joy to watch this bloke who was all, "We are coming to make entry to your house and the police will help." Before we went and be told to sit down and not say anything else unless he was asked a question. To fend off some of the questions, it's to do with a disconnected meter at my house for electric to a closed shop. I have written to the CEO. I've had my MP involved and been to court 4 times. British Gas don't change. Don't listen, so I've given up. I'll just go to court every now and again and claim my £600. Edit. I just remembered. They had to transfer the money electronically as we were going to send the bailiffs in, as they took 27 days to pay. TBH, I was a little disappointed when they paid up. Arnold. But there was a case going on in my town between a father and son that was hilarious. The dad is a big time personal injury attorney around here who started his own firm under his name. George Sink, and his son ended up joining the family business. Well, they had a falling out, so the son goes off to start his own firm. He has his dad's name. So the dad is suing the son for using the name he gave him to start his own law firm. Not someone else, but himself. The guy and his lawyer missed court appearances. Sometimes one of them, sometimes both. With little or no warning, and with suspect excuses. It started getting ridiculous, and we kept pointing out holes in his story. Like he said he left for another country without knowing about the appearance. But his lawyer stood in court and said he told him beforehand. Or all of a sudden he was in a former Soviet bloc country for fertility treatments, and it would ruin everything if he came back now. Or when he was visiting dying relatives on another continent. Or he was going to the airport when he had to rush to the hospital. and showed us an admitting form in another language that we translated. It showed he was there but also that he was discharged. He also tried firing his attorney and saying he needed more time to brief a new attorney, who at the next appearance would say he hasn't been able to talk to his client, so he needs to adjourn. Or that he hasn't been paid and his client is basically an ass and he needs to be relieved. We kept saying to the judge he was doing it to stall, but the judge kept giving him the benefit of the doubt. We even showed him other cases where he skipped appearances and the judges threatened sanctions. Until finally he didn't show up for an appearance where the judge had specifically told him, "I don't care if you're meeting with the Pope. I'm ordering you to be here." Boom. His answer was stricken. Default judgment in full was granted to our side. Neither he nor his lawyer showed up for the hearing where the judge determined exactly how much of a judgment we should get, and then had the nerve to file a motion that the judgment was unfair because he didn't get a chance to dispute anything. Had a criminal jury trial for misdemeanor criminal mischief over 4 years ago. State filed charges and kept amending the information to the point where they left the actual victim out of the trial and proceeded with the 2 eyewitnesses. Well, one of the witnesses was my client's ex and the other witness was the ex's new GF. They claimed my client vandalized the actual victim's car. Client denied everything. Well, apparently, the state and both witnesses had no idea that the ex had a outstanding warrant for not paying child support to my client, which created a motive for him to lie. Asked him if he was aware that he had a warrant out for his arrest on the stand. He didn't know. The judge excused the jurors. The bailiffs arrested the ex on the stand. State rested. Judge granted our motion for judgment of acquittal because we had good case law for the victim not being there. Client walked away free and the ex went to jail.